Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we're exploring the entire history of Jason Voorhees, from his tragic origins to his place among the legends of horror. If you enjoy what we do here, subscribing helps us reach 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean the world. Now, let's begin. There is a place in New Jersey where the forest grows thick and the water lies still, a place called Camp Crystal Lake. Long before it became synonymous with fear and legend, it was simply a summer camp, a place where children laughed and counselors sang songs beneath the stars. The lake itself stretches wide and deep, its surface reflecting the surrounding pines like a dark mirror. On quiet evenings, the only sounds are crickets and the gentle lapping of water against wooden docks. The camp was founded with good intentions, a place for young people to experience nature, to learn, to grow. But something happened here, something that would transform this peaceful retreat into a name whispered with dread. The locals would eventually call it Camp Blood, and they would warn strangers to stay away. The trees remember what happened, and the water keeps its secrets. In the year 1946, a child was born who would one day become the most enduring figure in horror cinema. His name was Jason Voorhees, and from the very beginning, his life was marked by hardship. Jason was born with physical deformities that set him apart from other children, conditions that affected his appearance and made him the target of cruelty from those who could not understand difference. His mother, Pamela Voorhees, loved him fiercely and completely, the way only a mother can love a child the world has rejected. She worked as a cook at Camp Crystal Lake, and when summer came, she brought young Jason with her. For Pamela, the camp was a place of employment. For Jason, it was supposed to be a place where he might find acceptance among other children. But childhood can be cruel, and children who are different often suffer the most. The summer of 1957 would change everything. Jason was 11 years old, a quiet boy who kept to himself, who watched the other children play from a distance. The counselors at Camp Crystal Lake were young, distracted by their own lives and interests, and they were supposed to be watching the children. They were supposed to keep everyone safe. But on one fateful day, their attention wandered, and Jason found himself alone by the water. What happened next has been told and retold, the details shifting like the surface of the lake itself. Jason went into the water, perhaps pushed, perhaps simply seeking to be part of something, and he did not come back up. The counselors were elsewhere, occupied with each other, unaware that a child was drowning in the dark waters of Crystal Lake. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. Jason Voorhees vanished beneath the waves, and the camp would never be the same. Pamela Voorhees was destroyed by grief. The loss of her son, her only child, the boy she had protected and loved despite a world that showed him no kindness, broke something inside her. She blamed the counselors, those careless young people whose negligence had cost her everything. In 1958, 1 year after Jason's drowning, tragedy struck Camp Crystal Lake again. 2 counselors were found dead. Their lives ended violently in the shadows of the cabins where they should have been safe. The killer was never identified, and the camp was forced to close. The owners tried to reopen it over the years, but misfortune followed every attempt. Fires broke out mysteriously. Water was found to be contaminated. It was as if the land itself rejected any effort to bring life back to this place. The locals began to whisper that Camp Crystal Lake was cursed, that the spirit of the drowned boy haunted its shores. The camp sat abandoned for over 2 decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Vines crept over the cabins. Paint peeled from wooden walls. The dock rotted and collapsed into the water. Nature has a way of erasing the marks of human presence, and Crystal Lake was returning to wilderness. But in 1979, a young man named Steve Christie decided to resurrect the camp. Steve had a connection to the place, a desire to restore it to its former purpose. He hired contractors to rebuild the cabins, to repair the docks, to clear the overgrown paths. And he put out a call for counselors, young people willing to spend the summer helping him prepare for the grand reopening. They came from different places, with different dreams, none of them knowing the history that soaked into the very soil beneath their feet. The counselors arrived at Camp Crystal Lake in the summer of 1980, full of optimism and energy. There was Alice Hardy, a thoughtful young woman with artistic dreams. There was Brenda, Jack, Marcy, Bill, and others, each of them young and full of life. The local townspeople tried to warn them. An old man in town, often dismissed as eccentric, told them they were doomed if they went to that place. He called it Camp Blood, and spoke of death as if it were a living thing waiting in the woods. The young counselors laughed off his warnings. Young people often believe themselves immune to the dangers that have claimed others. They drove up the long road through the forest, past the wooden sign that read Camp Crystal Lake, and they began their work of restoration, unaware that they were being watched. The first night brought rain, heavy sheets of water that drummed against cabin roofs and turned the paths to mud. The counselors settled into their routine, painting walls, cleaning floors, preparing for the children who would arrive in a few weeks. But one by one, they began to disappear. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole. A young woman went to check on a noise and never returned. A couple seeking privacy in a cabin found only death waiting for them. The killer moved through the camp like a shadow, unseen and relentless, claiming lives with methodical precision. Steve Christie, returning late from town, met his end on the road before he could reach his counselors. The rain continued to fall, washing away footprints, muffling screams. Alice Hardy survived longer than the others. Perhaps it was luck, perhaps it was something else. But as the night wore on and she discovered the bodies of her friends, Alice found herself alone against an enemy she did not understand. She barricaded herself in a cabin, listening to the storm outside, waiting for dawn that seemed like it would never come. And then a vehicle arrived, headlights cutting through the rain, and Alice thought she was saved. A woman emerged from the car, middle-aged and wearing a warm sweater, introducing herself as an old friend of the Christies. Her name was Pamela Voorhees, and she seemed concerned about the young counselors, seemed helpful and kind. Alice, traumatized and desperate, welcomed her. But Pamela Voorhees had not come to help. As she spoke to Alice, her words began to reveal the truth. She talked about the camp, about the counselors, about her son Jason, who had drowned all those years ago while the counselors were not watching. Her voice shifted from concern to cold fury as she recounted the negligence that had cost her child his life. The pain of over 20 years poured out of her, and Alice realized with growing horror that she was face to face with the killer. Pamela had returned to Camp Crystal Lake to ensure it would never reopen, to punish anyone who dared to bring life back to the place where her son had died. She spoke of Jason as if he were still present, as if his voice guided her hands. And then she attacked. The confrontation between Alice and Pamela Voorhees is burned into the history of horror cinema. Alice fought for her life against a grieving mother transformed into something terrifying by decades of unprocessed loss. The battle took them from the cabin to the shore of the lake, rain still falling, thunder rolling across the sky. Alice, finding strength she did not know she possessed, managed to defend herself. She found a weapon, and in a moment that would echo through the decades to come, Pamela Voorhees met her end by the shores of Crystal Lake, not far from where her son had drowned so many years before. Alice, bloody and exhausted, collapsed into a canoe that drifted onto the still water of the lake, waiting for rescue that would come with the morning light. As dawn broke over Crystal Lake, Alice floated in that canoe, half conscious, the nightmare seemingly over. The water was calm now, glass-like, reflecting the pale morning sky. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, help finally arriving too late for everyone except her. And then something happened that would launch a legend. From beneath the surface of the lake, a figure emerged. It was a boy, or something that had once been a boy, deformed and decaying, reaching up from the dark water to pull Alice under. She woke screaming in a hospital bed. The police told her there was no boy, that the lake had been searched and nothing was found. They called it a dream, a hallucination born of trauma. But Alice knew what she had seen, and somewhere in the depths of Crystal Lake, something stirred. The first Friday the 13th film was released in 1980, created by director Sean S. Cunningham and writer Victor Miller. It was made on a modest budget of approximately $550,000, a small investment that would yield enormous returns. The film drew inspiration from the success of John Carpenter's Halloween 2 years earlier, recognizing that audiences had an appetite for horror that was more personal, more visceral than the gothic tales of previous decades. Betsy Palmer brought Pamela Voorhees to life with a performance that balanced maternal grief with homicidal rage. The twist that the killer was not a monster, but a mourning mother, shocked audiences who had expected something more conventional. The film became a massive commercial success, earning nearly $60 million worldwide. The ending of that first film, with young Jason rising from the lake, was a last-minute addition suggested by makeup effects artist Tom Savini. It was intended as a dream sequence, a final shock to send audiences out of theaters with their hearts racing. No sequel was planned. The story of Camp Crystal Lake and the Voorhees family was meant to end with the credits rolling. But the film's extraordinary success changed everything. Audiences wanted more. They wanted to know if Jason was real, if he had survived, if the terror of Crystal Lake would continue. The producers saw opportunity, and within a year, work began on a sequel that would transform Jason from a tragic figure in his mother's delusion into the central icon of one of horror's longest-running franchises. Alice Hardy, the lone survivor of that terrible night, returned home believing the nightmare was over. She tried to resume her normal life, to process the trauma through therapy and the passage of time. But 2 months after the events at Camp Crystal Lake, something found her. In the opening moments of Friday the 13th Part 2, released in 1981, Alice's story comes to an end. She receives a phone call with no one on the other end. She finds the severed head of Pamela Voorhees in her refrigerator, a gruesome trophy that should have been in police evidence. And then Jason Voorhees, very much alive and very much seeking vengeance for his mother's death, claims his first victim. Alice Hardy, who had survived so much, became the first to fall in Jason's long campaign of retribution. Part 2 answered the question that audiences had been asking since the first film's shocking ending. Jason had not drowned as a child, Or if he had somehow survived. He had lived alone in the woods, surrounding Crystal Lake for over 2 decades, a feral creature surviving on instincts and grief. He had witnessed his mother's death at Alice's hands, and that sight had awakened something in him. The man-child who emerged in this sequel was not supernatural, not yet. He was simply a survivor, damaged and dangerous, driven by a need to protect the memory of his mother and punish anyone who dared return to their territory. He had built a crude shelter deep in the forest, and within it, he had created a shrine centered on his mother's severed head, her sweater, her memory. The Jason of Part 2 did not wear the hockey mask that would become his signature. Instead, he wore a burlap sack over his head, a single hole cut for one eye, giving him the appearance of a scarecrow come to life. His face was still hidden, still mysterious, but his body told the story of a hard life in the wilderness. He was large, powerful, his movements those of someone who had learned to hunt and survive without human contact. When new counselors arrived at a training camp near Crystal Lake, drawn by the same optimism that had doomed their predecessors, Jason watched from the shadows. They were young, full of dreams, unaware that they had entered the hunting ground of something that had been waiting for them. Among those counselors was a young woman named Ginny Field, a psychology student whose training would give her insights that others lacked. As her fellow counselors fell one by one to the figure in the woods, Ginny managed to survive long enough to understand what she was facing. She theorized about Jason's psychology, about the child who had been abandoned, who had watched his mother killed, who had never developed past that moment of trauma. When she finally confronted Jason in his forest shrine, surrounded by candles and the remnants of his mother, Ginny made a desperate choice. She put on Pamela Voorhees' sweater and spoke to Jason as if she were his mother, commanding him to stop. For a moment, it worked. For a moment, Jason hesitated, caught between the reality before him and the voice of the mother he had lost. The climax of Part 2 established elements that would define the franchise going forward. Jason could be confused by reminders of his mother. He was driven by loyalty to her memory above all else. And despite appearing to fall in battle, he had an uncanny ability to survive what should have been fatal wounds. Ginny Field survived that night, though the ending left questions unanswered about the fate of others. The film performed well enough to guarantee another sequel, and the legend of Jason Voorhees continued to grow. He was no longer just a tragic backstory in his mother's rampage. He was the monster of Crystal Lake, and audiences could not get enough of him. The year 1982 brought the 3rd chapter in Jason's saga, and with it came the most iconic transformation in horror history. Friday the 13th. Part 3 was released in 3D, taking advantage of a technology that was experiencing a revival in cinemas. Audiences donned special glasses to watch objects fly toward them from the screen, a gimmick that the filmmakers embraced fully. But beyond the technical novelty, this film would give Jason Voorhees the visual identity that would define him forever. Director Steve Miner returned from Part 2, bringing continuity to the growing mythology. The story picked up shortly after the previous film's events, with Jason having survived his wounds and fled deeper into the wilderness surrounding Crystal Lake. The setting shifted slightly for this 3rd installment. Instead of a camp, the action centered on Higgins Haven, a lakeside property owned by the family of a young woman named Chris Higgins. Chris had her own history with this place. Memories she had tried to bury but which refused to stay forgotten. Years before the events of the film, Chris had encountered something in the woods near Crystal Lake. The details of that encounter were left deliberately vague, shrouded in trauma and fragmented recollection. She remembered running through the forest, remembered being caught, remembered waking up in her own bed with no clear understanding of what had happened in between. That shadow had haunted her dreams ever since, and returning to Higgins Haven was her attempt to confront her fears. Chris brought friends with her, a group of young people seeking a weekend of relaxation away from city life. Among them was a young man named Shelley, whose defining characteristic was his love of pranks and practical jokes. Shelley carried a bag of tricks with him wherever he went, masks and fake blood and props designed to scare his friends. He was insecure, using humor as a shield against a world that had not always been kind to him. In his collection of props was a hockey goalie mask, white with red markings, the kind worn by players to protect their faces from pucks traveling at dangerous speeds. Shelley had no way of knowing that this simple piece of sporting equipment would become one of the most recognized symbols in cinema history. Jason made his way to Higgins Haven, still wearing the burlap sack from the previous film, still hunting, still driven by impulses that had long since consumed whatever humanity he might have once possessed. The young people at the property fell to him one by one, each encounter taking place in barns by the lake, in the shadows where Jason felt most comfortable. And then Jason encountered Shelley, and everything changed. When Jason emerged from that encounter, the burlap sack was gone. In its place was the hockey mask, white and expressionless, transforming his already imposing figure into something elemental. The mask gave Jason a face that was somehow more terrifying than the deformed features it concealed. It was blank, emotionless, inevitable. Chris Higgins found herself once again facing the nightmare from her past. Only now she could see it clearly. The thing that had haunted her memories had a shape, had a name, had been real all along. The final confrontation took place in the barn at Higgins Haven, a claustrophobic space of wooden beams and rusted tools. Chris fought with everything she had, using her knowledge of the property, using her desperation, using whatever weapons came to hand. In the end, she struck Jason with an axe that embedded itself in his skull. He fell, and for a moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. Chris, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, collapsed into a canoe that drifted onto the lake, echoing Alice's experience from the first film. The morning brought a vision that mirrored the original film's shocking conclusion. As Chris floated on the calm water, exhausted beyond measure, she saw something in the window of the farmhouse by the shore. It was a woman, decayed and terrible, who seemed to leap from the window toward her. Chris woke screaming. Rescued by police, the woman revealed to be another trauma-induced hallucination. Or perhaps not. The Friday the 13th films had established a pattern of ambiguous endings, leaving audiences uncertain about what was real and what was nightmare. Chris survived physically, but the psychological wounds ran deep, and Jason, despite the axe in his head, would not remain fallen for long. Friday the 13th. Part 3 was a commercial success, proving that audiences remained hungry for the saga of Crystal Lake. The hockey mask became instantly iconic, appearing on merchandise, inspiring countless imitations, becoming shorthand for the slasher genre itself. Jason Voorhees had completed his transformation from tragic backstory to horror icon. He had a look now, a silhouette recognizable even from a distance. The blank white face of that hockey mask would stare out from movie posters for decades to come. But the producers, despite their success, began to feel that the story was reaching its natural conclusion. The next film would be marketed as the final chapter, an ending to the saga of Jason Voorhees. Friday the 13th. The final chapter arrived in theaters in 1984, promising to end what had become one of horror's most profitable franchises. Director Joseph Zito brought a grittier sensibility to the material, and the production recruited Tom Savini to return to the series. Savini had created the effects for the original film, including the shocking emergence of young Jason from the lake. He agreed to return specifically because he wanted to be the one to definitively kill the character he had helped bring to life. The final chapter would be darker, more intense, and it would introduce a character who would become central to the mythology going forward. The film opens in the immediate aftermath of Part 3, with Jason's body being transported to the local morgue. He lies on a metal table, the axe wound in his head, presumably fatal. Medical examiners preparing to process another victim of violence. But Jason is not dead. He never seems to be dead, not truly. He rises from that table in the cold, sterile light of the morgue, claims the lives of those present, and begins his journey back toward Crystal Lake. The land calls to him, the water, the trees, the memories that are all he has left. He returns to the territory he knows, the hunting ground where he has become apex predator. Near Crystal Lake lived the Jarvis family, a mother and her 2 children occupying a house on the outskirts of the cursed territory. Trish Jarvis was a teenager, responsible and protective of her younger brother. Tommy Jarvis was 12 years old, a bright child with an unusual hobby. Tommy was fascinated by movie makeup and special effects, spending hours in his room creating masks and prosthetics, studying how illusions were crafted to fool the eye. His walls were covered with his creations, faces of monsters and aliens and creatures from his imagination. This skill, born of childhood fascination, would prove to be the key to survival when Jason came to their neighborhood. A group of teenagers had rented the house next door to the Jarvis residence. Young people looking for a weekend of freedom away from parental supervision. Among them were characters who would meet the fate that audiences had come to expect from these films. But there was also Rob Dyer, a young man with his own connection to the Crystal Lake killings. Rob's sister had been among Jason's victims in Part 2, and he had come to these woods seeking vengeance. He carried weapons and determination, tracking the killer through the forest, believing himself prepared for the confrontation ahead. He was not prepared. No one ever truly is. The night of violence that followed was among the most intense the series had produced. Jason moved through both houses, methodical and relentless, his hockey mask catching moonlight as he claimed victim after victim. Rob Deere met his end despite his preparations, his quest for vengeance concluding in failure. The teenage neighbors fell one by one until only Trish and Tommy remained, barricaded in their home, listening to Jason attempting to break through their defenses. Tommy watched through windows, his young mind racing, searching for any advantage against the unstoppable force outside. Tommy Jarvis made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Using his skills with makeup and transformation, he shaved his head and applied prosthetics to make himself resemble the young Jason Voorhees from old newspaper clippings. When Jason broke through into the house, when he had Trish cornered and death seemed certain, Tommy stepped forward wearing the face of Jason's childhood. The effect was profound. Jason hesitated, confused by this echo of his former self, caught off guard for perhaps the first time in his killing career. that hesitation gave Tommy the opening he needed. He grabbed a machete and attacked. The death of Jason Voorhees in the final chapter was brutal and definitive, or so it seemed. Tommy's assault was relentless, driven by terror and desperation, continuing long after Jason had fallen. The scene was disturbing in its intensity, showing a child pushed to extremes of violence by circumstances beyond his control. When it was over, Jason lay still, truly still, and Tommy stood over him, changed forever by what he had done. The final shot of the film focused on Tommy's face in the hospital, his eyes holding something new and troubling. He had looked into the abyss, and something had looked back. The final chapter ended with questions about whether Tommy himself might have been transformed by his encounter with evil. Tom Savini had fulfilled his mission to kill Jason Voorhees, but the franchise had other plans. The final chapter earned over $32 million at the box office, proving that audiences still wanted more Crystal Lake. The producers faced a dilemma. They had promised an ending, had killed their monster definitively, yet the demand for more Jason remained strong. The solution they devised would prove to be the most controversial decision in the franchise's history. If Jason was truly dead, then perhaps someone else could wear the mask. Perhaps the legend had grown large enough to exist independent of the original killer. Friday the 13th. A New Beginning arrived in 1985, and it attempted something unprecedented in the series. The film followed Tommy Jarvis, now a teenager portrayed by John Shepard, struggling with the psychological aftermath of his childhood encounter with Jason. Tommy had spent years in institutions, haunted by nightmares of the hockey mask, never fully recovering from the violence he had both witnessed and committed. He was transferred to Pinehurst, a halfway house in the countryside designed to help troubled young people transition back into society. The facility was isolated, surrounded by woods, perhaps not the wisest setting for someone traumatized by forest-based horror. Tommy was not well. He saw Jason everywhere, hallucinations that blurred the line between memory and present reality. The other residents of Pinehurst had their own struggles, their own reasons for being there, each carrying burdens that had brought them to this place of attempted healing. Among them was a young man named Joey, whose eager attempts at friendship often irritated those around him. Joey met a tragic end early in the film, struck down by another resident in a moment of violent rage. His death set in motion a chain of events that would eventually reveal the truth behind A New Beginning's central mystery. Deaths began to occur around Pinehurst, killings that bore the hallmarks of Jason Voorhees. The hockey mask appeared again, the methodical violence, the seemingly unstoppable killer stalking through woods and buildings alike. Tommy's mental state deteriorated as his worst fears seemed to be confirmed. Jason had returned, had followed him from Crystal Lake, would never stop hunting him. The body count rose and the survivors grew fewer until the film reached its climax and its controversial revelation. The killer was not Jason Voorhees. Jason remained dead, buried after the events of the final chapter. The murders had been committed by Roy Burns, a paramedic who had responded to Joey's death at Pinehurst. Roy Burns was Joey's father, a secret he had kept, a connection severed years before. Seeing his son's body had broken something in Roy, awakening a rage that found expression through the iconography of Jason Voorhees. He had adopted the hockey mask as his own, using the legend of Crystal Lake to mask his personal vengeance. The revelation divided audiences sharply. Many felt cheated, having paid to see Jason Voorhees only to discover an imposter behind the mask. The film was criticized for its bait and switch, for promising the return of a beloved monster and delivering something else entirely. Yet there was something interesting in the concept, the idea that Jason had become larger than any single person, that his mask could be worn by anyone consumed by sufficient grief and rage. The ending of A New Beginning suggested darker possibilities still. Tommy, pushed beyond his limits by the night's events, stood before a mirror holding a hockey mask. The implication was clear. The cycle of violence might continue through Tommy himself, the boy who had killed Jason now potentially becoming Jason's successor. This thread would be picked up and transformed in the following film, but A New Beginning remains the odd chapter in the franchise, the one where Jason himself never appears except in dreams and hallucinations. It performed adequately at the box office but left fans hungry for the real thing. The producers heard the message. The next film would bring Jason back, truly and definitively, in a way that would change the character forever. The year 1986 brought Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, and with it came a fundamental transformation of Jason Voorhees. Director Tom McLaughlin took the helm with a vision that embraced both horror and dark humor, acknowledging the absurdity that had crept into the franchise while still delivering the thrills audiences expected. The film opened with Tommy Jarvis, now an adult portrayed by Tom Matthews, determined to end his nightmares once and for all. He had a plan, simple in concept if extreme in execution. He would go to the cemetery where Jason was buried, dig up the body, and destroy it completely. Only then, Tommy believed, would he finally be free. Tommy recruited a friend to help him with this midnight task, driving through rain to reach the cemetery on the outskirts of what had once been Crystal Lake. The town had changed its name to Forest Green, attempting to escape the dark legacy that had made it infamous. The residents wanted to forget, wanted to believe that the horror was over, that their community could move forward without the shadow of Jason Voorhees hanging over everything. They had forbidden any mention of Crystal Lake, any discussion of the events that had occurred there. But trauma cannot be buried so easily, and some things refuse to stay in the ground. Tommy and his companion found the grave, dug through wet earth until they reached the coffin, pried open the lid to reveal the decayed remains of Jason Voorhees. The body was real, was present, was proof that Jason had truly died years before. Tommy should have felt relief. Instead, he felt rage. He grabbed a metal fence post and drove it into Jason's corpse, stabbing again and again, releasing years of anger and fear. And then lightning struck. A bolt from the storm above hit the metal post embedded in Jason's chest, sending electricity coursing through the remains. What happened next defied all natural law. Jason's eyes opened. His hand moved. The dead did not stay dead at Crystal Lake. This was the moment when Jason Voorhees transcended his origins. Before Jason Lives, he had been mortal, dangerous but theoretically killable, a human being twisted by trauma and survival. After the lightning strike, he became something else entirely. Jason rose from that grave as a revenant, a creature of supernatural origin, no longer bound by the limitations of living flesh. He was stronger than before, more resilient, driven by forces that went beyond psychology or motivation. Tommy fled in terror, leaving his friend behind to become the first victim of this reborn Jason. The monster had returned, and he was more powerful than ever. The transformation allowed the franchise to embrace elements it had previously only hinted at. Jason was now explicitly supernatural, which freed the filmmakers from needing to explain how he survived increasingly extreme injuries. It also gave the character a mythic quality, elevating him from slasher villain to something approaching legend. Tommy tried to warn the authorities, tried to explain what had happened at the cemetery, but no one believed him. The sheriff of Forest Green saw only a troubled young man with a history of mental illness, making wild claims about dead killers rising from graves. Tommy was arrested, locked away for his own protection, while Jason made his way back toward the lake that had defined his existence. Camp Forest Green had reopened, the renamed Camp Crystal Lake now hosting a new generation of children seeking summer adventure. For the first time in the franchise, actual children were present at the camp, raising the stakes considerably. The counselors watching over them were young adults following in the footsteps of all those who had come before, unaware of the history soaked into the soil beneath their feet. Jason approached his former territory and found it full of life, full of the sounds of laughter and play that he had been denied as a child. The summer camp that had been his death would now witness his resurrection. Tommy eventually escaped custody with the help of Megan, the sheriff's daughter who believed his warnings. Together, they raced toward the camp, toward a confrontation that had been building since Tommy was 12 years old. The night that followed was a battle between the young man who had once killed Jason and the revenant who refused to die. Tommy devised a plan based on the legends he had studied, the old stories that suggested evil could be contained if properly bound. He lured Jason into Crystal Lake, wrapped a chain around his neck connected to a boulder, and dragged him down into the depths where he had supposedly drowned as a child. The final moments of Jason Lives showed Tommy and Megan floating on the lake's surface, dawn breaking over the water. Jason chained at the bottom beneath them. He was not dead, could perhaps never truly die now, but he was contained. The water that had claimed him as a child now served as his prison. Tommy Jarvis had found a measure of peace, had faced his demon and survived, had given the town of Forest Green a respite from horror. The children at the camp were safe, frightened but unharmed, the first young campers in the franchise's history to survive an encounter with Jason Voorhees. It was a small victory, but victories against Jason were always measured in survival rather than defeat. Jason rested at the bottom of Crystal Lake, chained to a boulder, suspended in the dark water that had shaped his entire existence. The years passed above him, seasons changing, the world moving forward while he remained motionless in his underwater prison. The town of Forest Green eventually reclaimed its original name, Crystal Lake, as memories faded and new generations grew up hearing the old stories as nothing more than campfire tales. But the lake kept its secret, and deep beneath the surface, Jason waited. He did not breathe, did not move, did not decay further than he already had. He simply existed, caught between death and something else, until the day when forces beyond ordinary understanding would set him free. Friday the 13th. Part 7. The New Blood arrived in 1988 with a concept that pushed the franchise in an unexpected direction. The original vision for the film had been even more ambitious, a crossover that would pit Jason against Carrie White, the telekinetic protagonist of Stephen King's novel. The rights to Carrie could not be obtained, but the core idea remained. Instead of Carrie, the filmmakers created Tina Shepard, a young woman with powerful psychic abilities that she could barely control. The result was sometimes called Jason vs. Carrie by fans who recognized the inspiration. a battle between supernatural forces that elevated the franchise beyond its slasher origins. Tina's story began in tragedy, as so many stories connected to Crystal Lake do. As a child, she had possessed abilities she did not understand, powers that manifested in moments of extreme emotion. During a confrontation with her abusive father at a cabin on Crystal Lake, young Tina's powers erupted. The dock collapsed, the water churned, and her father was pulled beneath the surface, drowning in the same lake that held so many other secrets. Tina blamed herself, carried the weight of that accidental act for years, struggled with guilt that no amount of therapy could fully address. The trauma locked away her abilities, buried them beneath layers of psychological defense, but they remained within her, waiting. Years later, Tina returned to Crystal Lake with her mother and a psychiatrist named Dr. Cruz. The stated purpose was therapeutic, a chance for Tina to confront the site of her childhood trauma and find closure. But Dr. Cruz had his own agenda, one that had nothing to do with Tina's well-being. He recognized the potential of her abilities, saw in her a subject for study and exploitation, and he manipulated her emotions to trigger manifestations of her power. His methods were cruel, designed to destabilize rather than heal, pushing Tina toward breakdown rather than recovery. In her distress, Tina walked to the dock one night and reached out with her mind toward the water, toward the father she had lost, trying desperately to undo what she had done as a child. What Tina pulled from the lake was not her father. Her psychic power reached deep into the water and found something else, something that had been waiting in darkness for years. The chains that held Jason snapped. The boulder that anchored him fell away, and Jason Voorhees rose from Crystal Lake once more, freed by the very power that had been meant to heal a broken young woman. He emerged from the water changed, his body showing the effects of years of submersion, his flesh decayed and waterlogged, his bones visible in places where skin had rotted away. The hockey mask remained, somehow still attached, the blank white face now even more skull-like than before. This film marked the debut of Kane Hodder in the role of Jason Voorhees, and his performance would define the character for a generation of horror fans. Hodder brought a physicality and presence to Jason that previous actors had only hinted at. His Jason moved with purpose, with weight, with an intensity that made every scene feel dangerous. The breathing behind the mask, the tilt of the head, the deliberate pace of his walk, all of these elements came together to create the most memorable interpretation of the character. Kane Hodder would portray Jason in 4 consecutive films, more than any other actor, and fans would come to consider his version the definitive Jason Voorhees. A group of young people had gathered at a house near the Shepherd cabin, celebrating a birthday, unaware of what had just been unleashed from the lake. They were the usual assortment of characters, each with their own personality and role to play in the drama to come. One by one, they encountered Jason as he made his way through the property, claiming lives with the methodical efficiency that had become his trademark. But this time was different. This time, there was someone who could fight back in ways that Jason had never encountered. When Tina realized what she had done, what she had released, she also discovered that her powers might be the only thing capable of stopping it. The confrontation between Tina and Jason was unlike anything the franchise had shown before. She hurled objects at him with her mind, collapsed structures around him, set him ablaze with psychically directed fire. Jason, for the first time, faced an opponent who could match his supernatural nature with abilities of her own. The battle escalated through the night, causing destruction to buildings and landscape alike, until Tina made a final, desperate gambit. She reached out once more to the lake, to the depths where her guilt resided, and she called forth something unexpected. Her father emerged from the water, or something wearing her father's form, and dragged Jason back down into Crystal Lake. The nightmare ended with both monsters returning to the depths. The New Blood performed modestly at the box office, its more fantastical elements dividing audiences who had come to expect a certain formula from their Friday the 13th experience. The film had been significantly edited to achieve an R rating, with much of the violence removed at the insistence of the ratings board. What remained was still effective, but those who have seen the deleted footage speak of a more brutal vision that was never allowed to reach theaters. Despite mixed reception, the film advanced Jason's mythology, establishing that he could be fought by supernatural means, even if he could not be permanently destroyed. And it gave fans Kane Hodder, whose contribution to the character's legacy cannot be overstated. The following year brought Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, a title that promised something the film could not quite deliver. The concept was exciting on paper, taking Jason out of the woods and placing him in the urban jungle of New York City. Imagine the hockey-masked killer stalking through Times Square, riding the subway, hunting victims through crowded streets. The reality was constrained by budget limitations that kept most of the action confined to a cruise ship traveling from Crystal Lake to Manhattan. Only the final act actually takes place in the city, and even then, the locations feel more like Vancouver, where much of the film was shot, than the genuine New York experience. The film opens with Jason being revived once again, this time through an anchor dragging an underwater electrical cable across his submerged body. The jolt of electricity mirrors his resurrection in Jason Lives, establishing a pattern of lightning and power bringing him back from dormancy. A graduating class from the Crystal Lake area had chartered a ship called the Lazarus for their senior trip to New York, departing from the very waters that held Jason prisoner. They brought him aboard unknowingly, a stowaway of the worst possible kind, and their journey toward celebration became a voyage into nightmare. Among the students was Rennie Wickham, a young woman with her own troubled connection to Crystal Lake. Rennie experienced visions throughout the film, glimpses of a young Jason Voorhees reaching toward her from dark water. These hallucinations suggested a previous encounter, something buried in her past, a childhood trauma that paralleled the larger mythology of the series. Her uncle had brought her to Crystal Lake as a child, had tried to teach her to swim by pushing her into the water, and something had touched her in those depths. Whether it was truly Jason or simply her imagination remained ambiguous, but the terror had stayed with her. The voyage of the Lazarus became a floating death trap as Jason moved through the ship, claiming victims in engine rooms and dance floors and narrow corridors. The confined space created a new kind of tension, the impossibility of escape when surrounded by open ocean. One by one, the students and crew fell, until only a handful of survivors remained when the ship finally reached New York Harbor. Rennie, along with a few others, escaped onto the docks and fled into the city streets, Jason following close behind. The Manhattan sequences, though brief, provided memorable images of Jason navigating an environment completely foreign to his woodland origins. The streets of New York did not welcome Jason any more than they welcomed anyone else. In one memorable scene, a group of street criminals attempted to accost him, only to flee in terror when he revealed his face beneath the mask. The city that never sleeps barely noticed the killer in its midst, too absorbed in its own chaos to register another source of violence. The survivors fled through alleys and into the subway system, into the tunnels beneath the city where darkness reigned. Jason pursued them into the sewers, those underground rivers that carried the waste of millions. And there, the film reached its strange conclusion. The sewers of Manhattan, according to the film's internal logic, were flooded with toxic waste at midnight as part of the city's maintenance routine. This detail has been questioned and mocked by audiences since the film's release, but within the story, it provides the mechanism for Jason's apparent defeat. Caught in the flood of toxic chemicals, Jason was transformed, reduced somehow to the form of a child lying in the tunnel as the waters receded. Rennie witnessed this transformation, saw the boy that Jason had been before tragedy twisted him into something monstrous. The ending was surreal, dreamlike, leaving audiences uncertain about what they had actually witnessed. Jason Takes Manhattan underperformed at the box office, earning less than its predecessors and receiving harsh criticism for failing to deliver on its premise. The promise of Jason in New York had excited fans, but the reality of a ship-bound slasher with only a taste of urban horror left many feeling cheated. This would be the final Friday the 13th film distributed by Paramount Pictures, the studio that had shepherded the franchise from its beginning. The rights would transfer to New Line Cinema, the house that Freddy Krueger built, and this change would open new possibilities for the hockey-masked killer. New Line saw potential in Jason, and they had plans that would push the character in directions no one had anticipated. 4 years passed before Jason returned to screens, the longest gap between sequels in the franchise's history to that point. Jason Goes to Hell. The final Friday arrived in 1993 with a subtitle that echoed the final chapter's false promise of conclusion. New Line. Cinema's approach to the material was radical, deconstructing the mythology that Paramount had built and replacing it with something entirely different. The film would divide fans more sharply than any previous entry, introducing concepts that contradicted established continuity while opening doors to crossover potential that had been impossible under Paramount's ownership. The opening sequence seemed designed to give audiences everything they wanted before pulling the rug from beneath them. Jason attacked a woman in a cabin by Crystal Lake, the familiar scenario playing out as expected, until the woman was revealed to be an FBI agent and the cabin surrounded by federal troops. Jason walked into an ambush, was riddled with gunfire, and was finally destroyed by a massive explosion that reduced his body to scattered pieces. It was the most thorough destruction of Jason ever shown on screen, seemingly definitive in a way that previous deaths had not been. His remains were collected and transported to a federal morgue, where the coroner prepared to examine what was left of horror's most persistent killer. What happened in that morgue changed everything. The coroner, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion, consumed Jason's still-beating heart. Through this act, something transferred from the remains into the living man, a dark essence that was the true source of Jason's power. The film revealed that Jason was not simply a man who refused to die, but a vessel for a demonic entity that could transfer between bodies. This Voorhees demon, as it came to be called, could possess anyone, moving from host to host while seeking a way to be reborn in its true form. Only a member of the Voorhees bloodline could serve as a permanent host, and only a Voorhees could truly destroy the demon using a mystical dagger. This revelation required the existence of Voorhees family members previously unknown to audiences. The film introduced Diana Kimball, revealed to be Jason's sister, and her daughter Jessica, Jason's niece. A granddaughter named Stephanie also existed, the youngest of the bloodline, and the demon sought to reach any of them to complete its rebirth. The plot followed Stephen Freeman, Jessica's former boyfriend and father of her child, as he tried to protect the family from both the possessing demon and a bounty hunter named Creighton Duke, who understood the true nature of Jason's evil. Duke had dedicated his life to destroying Jason and possessed knowledge of the demon's weaknesses. The demon moved through multiple hosts during the film, each possession temporary, each body eventually deteriorating under the strain of containing such malevolent force. The sequences of transformation were body horror of a different kind than the franchise had shown before. Flesh bubbling and shifting as the demon attempted to maintain control of borrowed forms. The true Jason only appeared in glimpses, the familiar hockey mask surfacing when the demon's power peaked, a reminder of the icon that audiences had come to know. The mythology had been altered, but the image remained the same. The climax brought all elements together at the old Voorhees house, a location never before mentioned in the series, where the final confrontation took place. Jessica managed to use the mystical dagger against the demon as it emerged in its true form, a twisted creature that was both Jason and something far older. The ground opened, and hands reached up from below, hellish forces claiming what belonged to them. Jason was dragged down into the earth, into what appeared to be literal hellfire, his mask left behind on the surface as the only evidence of his existence. The final shot of Jason Goes to Hell showed that mask lying in the dirt, silent and still, until a familiar clawed glove burst from the ground and pulled it under. Freddy Krueger's glove, unmistakable to any horror fan, claimed Jason's mask as a trophy and a promise. That final image electrified horror fans who had long dreamed of a crossover between the two great slasher icons. New Line Cinema owned both properties now, both Jason and Freddy, and that closing shot was a declaration of intent. The two monsters would eventually meet, though audiences would have to wait another decade for that promise to be fulfilled. Jason Goes to Hell performed disappointingly at the box office, its radical reimagining of the mythology alienating fans who preferred the simpler slasher formula of earlier entries. The demonic possession angle, the Voorhees bloodline, the mystical dagger. All of these elements felt foreign to a franchise that had been built on more straightforward horror. Yet the film had set the stage for what was to come, planting seeds that would eventually bloom into the crossover event fans had been promised. The mythology introduced in Jason Goes to Hell has never been fully reconciled with the previous films. The existence of Jason's sister and extended family contradicts the isolated tragedy of Pamela and her son that had defined the original story. The demonic nature of Jason raises questions about everything that came before, about whether he had always been something more than human, or whether the demon was a later addition to his existence. Fans have debated these points for decades, some embracing the expanded mythology, and others dismissing it as a failed experiment. The film remains the most divisive entry in the franchise, loved by some for its ambition and rejected by others for straying too far from what made Friday the 13th successful. In the years following Jason Goes to Hell, the franchise entered a period of uncertainty. Plans for the Freddy vs. Jason crossover moved forward in fits and starts, with multiple scripts developed and discarded, unable to find the right balance between the two icons. Meanwhile, Jason remained in hell, at least according to the mythology, waiting for resurrection that seemed perpetually delayed. The 90s were a difficult time for slasher films in general, with audiences turning toward other forms of horror, and the great icons of the 80s found themselves diminished. But Jason had survived worse than changing tastes. He had survived death itself multiple times. He would survive this too. The years continued to pass in the world above, while Jason remained in whatever realm had claimed him at the end of Jason Goes to Hell. The horror landscape shifted and changed, new franchises rising while old ones faded into memory. Scream revitalized the slasher genre in 1996 with its self-aware approach to horror conventions, and suddenly, the straightforward terror of earlier decades seemed almost quaint. Studios scrambled to capture this new audience, and the classic monsters found themselves competing with younger, more ironic creations. But true icons do not disappear simply because tastes change. They wait, patient as the grave, until the moment is right for their return. Jason X arrived in theaters in 2001, though its production had been completed years earlier. The film had languished in distribution limbo, delayed repeatedly while New Line Cinema focused on finally bringing the Freddy vs. Jason crossover to fruition. When Jason X finally reached audiences, it came with a concept so audacious that it seemed almost like parody. Jason Voorhees in space. The killer who had haunted the woods of New Jersey for decades would now stalk victims among the stars, transported centuries into the future to continue his eternal mission of destruction. The premise invited ridicule, yet the film embraced its absurdity with enough self-awareness to transform potential weakness into unlikely strength. The story begins in the near future, the year 2010, at a government research facility where Jason has been captured and contained. The authorities have finally recognized what horror fans knew all along, that Jason cannot be killed by conventional means, that every attempt at execution only delays his inevitable return. Scientists wish to study him, to understand how a human being could survive such extreme physical trauma, to perhaps harness his regenerative abilities for beneficial purposes. But one researcher argues for a different solution. If Jason cannot be killed, then perhaps he can be frozen, placed in cryogenic suspension until technology advances enough to deal with him permanently. Before the cryogenic process can be completed, Jason escapes his restraints and begins doing what he has always done. The research facility becomes another hunting ground, sterile corridors replacing forest paths, scientists falling where counselors once fell. The lone survivor is Rowan, the researcher who had advocated for freezing Jason, and in the chaos of his rampage, both she and Jason end up caught in the cryogenic system. The facility is sealed and forgotten, abandoned as the years pass, as decades become centuries, as humanity itself changes in ways that would be unrecognizable to those who lived in the time of Crystal Lake. 445 years later, Earth has been abandoned. Environmental catastrophe and resource depletion drove humanity to the stars, to new worlds designated Earth 2, where civilization rebuilt itself far from the poisoned cradle that had birthed it. The original Earth became a curiosity, a historical site occasionally visited by researchers and students seeking to understand the old world. A field trip from Earth 2 discovers the abandoned research facility, finds 2 perfectly preserved bodies in cryogenic suspension, and brings them aboard their ship, the Grendel, for study and eventual profit. The students and their professor see the woman as a potential historical witness, and the large man in the hockey mask as an archaeological curiosity. They have no idea what they have awakened. The technology of the 25th century is advanced beyond anything Jason would have encountered in his previous existence. The ship's medical bay contains nanobots, microscopic machines capable of repairing damaged tissue at the cellular level. When these machines are applied to Jason's thawing body, they do not simply repair him. They enhance him, rebuilding damaged flesh with metallic components, transforming him into something beyond even what he had been. This upgraded Jason, dubbed Uber Jason by fans, combines his supernatural resilience with technological augmentation, creating a threat that not even the advanced weapons of this future society can easily counter. Kane Hodder returned for his fourth and final portrayal of Jason Voorhees in this film, bringing the same physical intensity that had defined his previous performances. The future setting allowed for creative variations on the familiar formula, with victims meeting their ends through means that would have been impossible in earlier entries. One memorable sequence involves a holographic recreation of Camp Crystal Lake, complete with virtual counselors programmed to provide the kinds of temptations that had lured so many real victims in the past. Jason's response to this simulation is almost playful, a rare moment of something approaching personality from a character usually defined by relentless silence. The crew of the Grendel falls one by one, as crews always fall when Jason is present. The future provides new tools for survival, but cannot fundamentally change the dynamic that has defined every Friday the 13th film. People run, people hide, people try to fight back, and Jason continues his methodical advance. Rowan, awakened from her centuries of sleep, finds herself in a world she does not recognize, facing a threat she thought had been contained forever. She becomes the unlikely leader of the survivors, her knowledge of Jason's history providing crucial context for those who had grown up never hearing the legends of Crystal Lake. The transformation into Uber. Jason occurs midway through the film, after conventional weapons seem to have finally destroyed him. The nanobots rebuild him with a metallic face, enhanced strength, and an appearance even more imposing than his original form. This new Jason is unstoppable in ways that transcend his previous incarnations, shrugging off attacks that would have at least slowed his earlier self. The survivors realize that destroying him is not an option with the resources available to them. Escape becomes the only goal, reaching the shuttle bay and fleeing before Jason can claim everyone aboard. The climax involves sacrifice and ingenuity, characters giving their lives to slow Jason's advance while others work desperately to secure an escape route. In the end, Jason is ejected from the ship, sent falling toward the atmosphere of Earth 2 below. The planet's defensive systems detect him as incoming debris and attempt to destroy him, and the final images show Jason burning through the atmosphere, a fireball streaking across the sky, ultimately splashing down in a lake that echoes the waters of Crystal Lake from which he first emerged. Two campers on the shore of this distant world witness the impact and go to investigate, their curiosity drawing them toward a fate that has repeated itself across centuries and light years. Jason X was not a commercial success, earning modest returns that reflected both its delayed release and the inherent challenges of its premise. Critics dismissed it as a desperate attempt to revitalize a dying franchise, and even fans of the series were divided on its merits. Yet, the film has gained appreciation over the years, its self-aware humor and creative kills earning it a cult following among those who appreciate its willingness to embrace absurdity. It exists outside the main continuity in many ways, a what-if scenario that imagines Jason's terror extending into an infinite future. The film proved that Jason could survive any setting, any time period, any challenge thrown at him. He is eternal in a way that goes beyond mere survival. While Jason X languished in release limbo during the late 90s, the project that fans had been anticipating since that teasing final shot of Jason Goes to Hell finally moved toward production. Freddy vs. Jason had been in development hell for over a decade, with numerous writers attempting to crack the challenge of bringing two iconic killers together in a way that satisfied fans of both franchises. The difficulties were substantial. How do you pit a dream demon against a physical revenant? How do you balance screen time between two characters who both demand to be the star? How do you create a story that respects both mythologies while still delivering the confrontation audiences craved? The solution that finally reached screens in 2003 framed the conflict as a manipulation, with Freddy Krueger using Jason as a tool to achieve his own resurrection. Freddy's power derives from fear, from the terror that the children of Springwood feel when they think of him. But the town had found a way to fight back, a conspiracy of silence that had erased Freddy from memory, institutionalizing any child who showed signs of dreaming about him, using experimental drugs to suppress dreams entirely. Without fear, Freddy was powerless, trapped in hell with no way to reach the living world that was his hunting ground. In his imprisonment, Freddy discovered Jason Voorhees, a kindred spirit of sorts, another killer who had been consigned to the depths. Freddy devised a plan that would use Jason's physical form to do what Freddy himself could not. He would enter Jason's dreams, manipulate the simple-minded killer into believing that his mother wanted him to attack Springwood, and watch as Jason's rampage reminded the town that monsters were real. The fear generated by Jason's attacks would open the door for Freddy's return. Jason would be his puppet, his instrument, the physical force that would pave the way for the Dream Demon's resurrection. The manipulation of Jason through his mother is one of the most compelling elements of the film. Freddy appears to Jason in the guise of Pamela Voorhees, wearing her face, speaking with her voice, commanding her son to go to Elm Street and punish the children there. Jason, despite his supernatural nature, despite his decades of existence, remains at his core a child seeking his mother's approval. He obeys without question, traveling to Springwood, finding his way to Elm Street, and beginning a new campaign of terror in a town that had thought itself safe from such things. The residents of Springwood do not immediately understand what is happening. They have never heard of Jason Voorhees. Their monster has always worn a different face. The teenagers of Springwood become caught between two killers, forced to navigate threats both in the waking world and in their dreams. The protagonist is Laurie Campbell, a young woman whose mother died under mysterious circumstances years before. She and her friends begin experiencing dreams of a burned man with a clawed glove, dreams that their parents and authorities seem desperate to suppress. The truth about Springwood's history with Freddy Krueger emerges gradually, revealed through investigation and the testimony of institutionalized witnesses who remember what the town tried to forget. Laurie realizes that her town has been living a lie, and that the lie is unraveling with every death Jason delivers. Freddy's plan succeeds too well. As fear returns to Springwood, he regains his power and begins killing teenagers in their dreams. But Jason continues killing too, taking victims that Freddy had marked for himself. The Dream Demon's frustration grows as he watches Jason claim prey that should have been his. The alliance of convenience begins to fracture, and Freddy decides that Jason must be stopped before he takes everything. The confrontation that fans had waited over a decade to see finally begins to take shape. Two icons of horror turning against each other in a battle for supremacy and survival. The film carefully balances its two monsters, giving each moments of dominance and vulnerability. Freddy is more intelligent, more verbal, more capable of psychological manipulation. Jason is stronger, more relentless, more difficult to damage through physical means. Their first confrontation occurs in the dream world, Freddy's territory, where the rules favor the Springwood slasher. Freddy torments Jason with visions of drowning, of childhood bullying, of the water that took his life and started his legend. For perhaps the first time, audiences see Jason as vulnerable, as frightened, as the victim he was before he became the victimizer. The dream sequence reveals depths to Jason's psychology that had only been hinted at in previous films. The survivors devise a plan to neutralize both killers, recognizing that neither Freddy nor Jason will stop as long as they exist. They sedate Jason to pull Freddy out of the dream world into physical reality, where his powers are diminished and he can be harmed by conventional means. The climactic battle takes place at Camp Crystal Lake, bringing the conflict back to where Jason's story began. The setting is perfect, a return to roots for one killer while being foreign territory for the other. Freddy and Jason clash among the familiar cabins and docks, their battle causing destruction that echoes the violence that has haunted this place for decades. The fight between Freddy and Jason delivers on the promise that had been made in Jason goes to hell's final shot. They exchange blows that would kill ordinary humans instantly, demonstrate their respective abilities, and show why each has earned their place in horror history. Freddy uses his intelligence and cruelty, finding Jason's weaknesses and exploiting them. Jason uses his unstoppable physicality, absorbing punishment that would destroy anyone else and continuing to advance. The battle is brutal and extended, giving fans the confrontation they had imagined through years of waiting. The resolution is deliberately ambiguous, refusing to declare a clear winner in a way that would alienate fans of either character. Both Freddy and Jason are defeated by the film's end, but neither is definitively destroyed. The final image shows Jason emerging from Crystal Lake carrying Freddy's severed head, which opens its eyes and winks at the camera, suggesting that both killers will return. The ambiguity frustrated some viewers who wanted a decisive conclusion, but it respected the nature of both characters. Freddy and Jason are both defined by their inability to stay dead. Declaring a final victor would have contradicted the essential nature of both icons. Freddy vs. Jason was a commercial success, the highest-grossing film in either franchise's history at that time. It proved that audiences still cared about these characters, that the icons of 80s horror could still draw crowds when presented in the right context. The film revitalized interest in both franchises, leading to discussions of sequels and further crossovers that would never materialize. A follow-up, tentatively titled Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, would have added the Evil Dead protagonist to the mix, but rights issues prevented the film from being produced, though a comic book adaptation eventually told that story. The theatrical crossover remained unique, a moment when two separate horror mythologies collided and created something memorable. The legacy of Freddy vs. Jason extends beyond its box office performance. It demonstrated that horror icons could coexist, that the boundaries between franchises could be crossed when the creative approach was right. It gave fans a version of the confrontation they had been imagining for years, different perhaps from individual expectations but satisfying as a whole. And it provided what would be, for many years, the final theatrical appearance of Jason Voorhees in his original continuity. The hockey mask had traveled from Crystal Lake to Manhattan, to Hell to Space to Elm Street, accumulating history with every step. What came next would be not a continuation, but a reimagining. The early 2000s brought a wave of horror remakes, classic films from the 70s and 80s being updated for new audiences. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street. All of these foundational texts of horror were remade with varying degrees of success. It was perhaps inevitable that Friday the 13th would receive the same treatment, that Jason Voorhees would be introduced to audiences who had never experienced the original films. The question was not whether a remake would happen, but what form it would take, and whether it could capture what made Jason compelling while updating the formula for contemporary tastes. The production that would eventually become the 2009 Friday the 13th remake went through various iterations during development. Some versions proposed a prequel showing Jason's original drowning and his survival in the wilderness. Others suggested a more radical reimagining that would change fundamental elements of the mythology. The I version that reached theaters attempted a balance, combining elements from the first 4 original films into a single cohesive narrative while modernizing the presentation and characters. It was produced by Platinum Dunes, the company responsible for many horror remakes of the era, and directed by Marcus Nispo, who had previously helmed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. The 2009 Friday the 13th opens with a prologue that compresses the events of the original film into a few haunting minutes. The year is 1980, and a young woman flees through the woods surrounding Camp Crystal Lake, pursued by someone whose face we do not yet see. The pursuer speaks of her son, of the counselors who let him drown, of the vengeance that has consumed her for over 2 decades. This is Pamela Voorhees in her final moments, and the young woman she chases is the lone survivor who will end her rampage. The confrontation is brief but brutal, ending as it must, with Pamela's life taken by the desperate woman defending herself. What makes this prologue significant is who watches from the shadows. A figure observes as his mother falls, as her head is separated from her body, and in that moment, something is born that will never die. The main narrative jumps forward to the present day, where a group of young people hikes through the woods near the abandoned camp, searching for a different kind of treasure. Rumors persist of marijuana fields hidden in the forest, crops supposedly planted years ago and left to grow wild, valuable enough to justify the trek into these isolated woods. The group is young, attractive, and doomed in the way that visitors to Crystal Lake have always been doomed. They make camp as night falls, telling stories around the fire, unaware that they are being watched by eyes that have observed countless similar gatherings over the decades. Among the group is Whitney Miller, a young woman whose resemblance to someone from the past will prove significant. She wanders from the campsite with a companion, exploring the ruins of the old camp, finding remnants of a life that ended decades ago. In one of the abandoned cabins, she discovers a locket containing a photograph, the image of a woman who could almost be Whitney herself. This woman is Pamela Voorhees, and the resemblance between her and Whitney is striking enough to give even a mindless killer pause. Before Whitney can process what she has found, Jason emerges from the darkness, and the night of terror begins. This version of Jason is different from previous incarnations in subtle but important ways. He is faster, more tactical, more intelligent in his approach to hunting. Previous Jasons had been relentless, but often seemed to simply walk toward their victims, trusting in their supernatural durability to overcome any resistance. The Jason of the remake uses the environment strategically, sets traps, employs tunnels beneath the camp to move unseen, and chooses his moments with predatory precision. Derek Mears, the actor beneath the hockey mask, brought an athleticism to the role that distinguished his performance from the more lumbering interpretations of the past. The initial group of victims falls quickly, their expedition into the woods ending in a single night of violence. But Whitney does not die. Jason takes her, drags her into his underground lair, keeps her alive for reasons that become clear only gradually. She resembles his mother. In his fractured mind, shaped by decades of isolation and trauma, Whitney represents something he lost, something he desperately wants to preserve. The remake introduces this psychological element, suggesting that beneath the mask and the violence, some remnant of the child who lost his mother still exists, still yearns for connection even as he destroys everyone who comes near. 6 weeks pass, and Whitney's brother Clay arrives at Crystal Lake, searching for his missing sister. Clay has been looking for weeks, following the trail that led Whitney and her friends to these woods, refusing to accept that she is simply gone. The local authorities have given up, have written off the missing hikers as victims of accident or misadventure. But Clay cannot let go. He distributes flyers with Whitney's photograph, asks questions in the small town near the lake, and gradually works his way toward the truth that everyone else has been too afraid to acknowledge. Something lives in those woods, something that has been there for a very long time. Clay's search coincides with the arrival of another group of young people, wealthy friends of a young man whose family owns property on Crystal Lake. They come for a weekend of recreation, of escape from their privileged lives, bringing with them all the supplies necessary for extended celebration. Their lakeside house is luxurious, a stark contrast to the rotting cabins of the abandoned camp nearby. They have no interest in local legends, no respect for the warnings that older residents might offer. They are young and believe themselves invincible, a belief that Crystal Lake has disproven many times before. The collision between Clay's desperate search and the group's heedless revelry creates the tension that drives the film's middle section. Clay finds potential allies among the newcomers, particularly a young woman named Jenna, who believes his story and wants to help. Others dismiss him as obsessive, resent his intrusion into their weekend, and actively work against his investigation. The social dynamics within the group reflect broader tensions between those who take the world seriously and those who float through it on waves of privilege and indifference. These dynamics become irrelevant when Jason begins his work. The deaths in the remake are handled with the same intensity that defined the original films, though the specific methods remain appropriately vague in this retelling. What matters is not how each victim falls, but the inexorable progress of Jason through the group, the narrowing of possibilities as the night continues, the growing realization among the survivors that they face something beyond ordinary human malevolence. Clay and Jenna work their way toward the old camp, toward the source of the evil that has plagued this lake for decades, while their friends fall one by one in the house they thought was safe. The underground tunnels beneath Camp Crystal Lake represent one of the remake's most distinctive additions to the mythology. Jason has not simply been living in the woods for 30 years. He has been building, expanding, creating a network of passages that allow him to move unseen across his territory. These tunnels connect the various buildings of the old camp, extend toward the lake, provide him with the ability to appear and disappear in ways that seem almost supernatural, but are actually the result of decades of patient labor. In these tunnels, Clay finally finds his sister, alive but changed by her weeks of captivity, kept as a living reminder of the mother Jason lost. The climax brings Clay, Whitney, and Jason together in a confrontation that echoes scenes from throughout the franchise's history. Whitney uses her resemblance to Pamela one final time, speaking to Jason as his mother might have spoken, creating a moment of hesitation that allows for counterattack. The battle is desperate and brutal, taking the survivors through the tunnels, through the old camp, finally to the dock that extends over Crystal Lake. Water has always been central to Jason's story, the element that claimed his childhood, that has served as both his grave and his birthplace multiple times. It is fitting that the remake's conclusion takes place where the mythology began. Jason is defeated, apparently killed, his body wrapped in chains and cast into the lake in an echo of Tommy Jarvis's solution from Jason Lives. Clay and Whitney survive, traumatized but alive, having faced the legend of Crystal Lake and emerged to tell the tale. But the film does not end with their victory. In its final moments, as the survivors rest by the shore, Jason bursts from the water one last time, reaching for them, refusing to stay dead even now. The screen cuts to black on this image, leaving audiences with the understanding that Jason Voorhees can never truly be destroyed. He is part of Crystal Lake now, as essential to its nature as the water and the trees. The remake performed well at the box office, earning over $90 million worldwide against a production budget of around $19 million. It was the highest-grossing opening weekend in the franchise's history, proof that Jason Voorhees still commanded audience attention nearly 3 decades after his first appearance. Critics were divided, some praising the updated approach while others lamented the loss of elements that had defined earlier films. Fans, similarly, split between appreciation for the fresh take and loyalty to the original. Continuity. The film exists in its own space, neither sequel nor direct remake, but something between, a reimagining that honors the source material while charting its own course. Plans for a sequel to the remake were discussed, but never materialized. The Friday the 13th franchise became entangled in legal disputes between the original screenwriter Victor Miller and the production company, arguments over who owned the rights to Jason Voorhees and his mythology. These legal battles have kept Jason off screens for years, preventing new films while lawyers argue over contracts signed decades ago. The character, who has survived drowning, electrocution, explosion, and dismemberment, finds himself unable to overcome the complexities of intellectual property law. It is perhaps the most mundane obstacle Jason has ever faced, and the one that has proven most effective at keeping him contained. Yet Jason Voorhees endures in ways that transcend any single film or legal ruling. He has become part of the cultural landscape, recognized by people who have never seen a Friday the 13th movie. His hockey mask a symbol that communicates threat and menace across language barriers and generational divides. Halloween stores stock his costume every October. Video games allow players to either embody him or flee from him. His image appears on merchandise ranging from action figures to coffee mugs, domesticated versions of terror that people welcome into their homes. The boy who drowned in Crystal Lake has become immortal in ways that have nothing to do with supernatural resurrection. The influence of Jason Voorhees on horror cinema cannot be overstated. Before Friday the 13th, the slasher genre existed but had not yet found its definitive form. Halloween had established many of the conventions, but it was the Friday the 13th franchise that codified them into a formula that would be repeated countless times. The isolated setting, the group of young people whose vices mark them for death, the seemingly unstoppable killer, the final girl who survives through resourcefulness and purity. All of these elements became standard because of their effectiveness in the Crystal Lake films. Subsequent slashers borrowed liberally from the template that Jason's films established. The character of Jason himself represents an evolution in how audiences relate to movie monsters. Unlike the universal monsters of earlier decades, who often inspired sympathy through their tragic circumstances, Jason began as pure threat, an unstoppable force with no personality beyond his drive to kill. But as the franchise continued, as audiences returned film after film to watch him work, something changed in the relationship between viewers and villain. People began to root for Jason, to anticipate his appearances, to judge films based on the creativity of his methods rather than the survival of his victims. He became the star of his own franchise in a way that transcended the horror genre's usual dynamics. This shift reflected broader changes in how audiences consumed horror. The video era transformed films like Friday the 13th from theatrical experiences into home viewing staples. Movies that teenagers watched at slumber parties, that played on cable television during late-night hours, that became shared cultural references among generations of viewers. Jason was no longer something you experienced once in a darkened theater. He was something you lived with, something you returned to repeatedly, a familiar face that paradoxically provided comfort through its very menace. The fear became ritualized, domesticated, transformed into entertainment that audiences actively sought. The men who wore the hockey mask across the franchise each brought something unique to the role. Warrington Gillette and Steve Daskowitz shared duties in Part 2, establishing the physical presence that would define the character. Richard Brooker gave Jason his iconic look in Part 3, the first to wear the hockey mask that would become synonymous with the character. Ted White brought intensity to the final chapter, while Tom Morga briefly donned the mask in A New Beginning as the copycat killer. C.J. Graham portrayed the newly supernatural Jason in Jason Lives, establishing the Revenant version of the character. Kane Hodder's 4-film run from The New Blood through Jason X created what many consider the definitive interpretation, his physical performance influencing every portrayal that followed. Ken Kersinger took on the role for Freddy vs. Jason, matching his size against Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger. Derek Mears brought athleticism and menace to the remake. Each actor contributed to a collective portrait of a character who transcends any single performance. The hockey mask itself has become one of cinema's most recognizable images, a simple piece of sporting equipment transformed into a symbol of dread. Its blankness is key to its effectiveness, the absence of expression more disturbing than any snarl or grimace could be. Behind the mask, there is no reasoning, no negotiation, no appeal to mercy. There is only Jason, patient and relentless, pursuing his purpose with single-minded determination. The mask allows audiences to project their own fears onto the character, to see in that white surface whatever most terrifies them. It is brilliant in its simplicity, a design choice made for practical reasons that achieved artistic perfection. Crystal Lake itself has become a character in the franchise, a location with its own personality and history. The lake exists in a liminal space between civilization and wilderness, close enough to populated areas that visitors keep arriving, yet remote enough that help never comes in time. Its waters are dark and deep, concealing secrets that surface only in moments of horror. The surrounding forest is dense and disorienting, paths that seem clear in daylight becoming mazes after sunset. The abandoned camp stands as monument to tragedy, its rotting structures serving as both tomb and temple for the violence that occurred there. Every Friday the 13th film returns to this place eventually, drawn back to the source like water flowing downhill. The franchise has explored Jason's psychology in various ways across its many installments, though he remains fundamentally unknowable. The child who drowned, the man who survived alone in the wilderness, the revenant who rose from death, the demon who possessed bodies, the cyborg who stalked through space. All of these are Jason, yet none of them fully explain him. He is motivated by loyalty to his mother, by territorial protection of his lake, by something that might be rage or might be instinct, impossible to distinguish from the outside. The films that have tried to explain him too thoroughly have generally been less successful than those that preserve his mystery. Some things are more frightening when they remain unexplained. The relationship between Jason and his mother forms the emotional core of the franchise, despite Pamela appearing in only one film as the primary antagonist. Her voice echoes through Jason's actions, her love and her madness intertwined in his psyche. The sweater that Ginny wore in Part 2, the hallucinations that tormented Tommy Jarvis, the disguise that Freddy Krueger adopted, all of these draw power from the bond between mother and son. Jason kills, at least in part, because his mother wanted the counselors punished. He protects Crystal Lake because it was their place, the site of their shared tragedy. Even after decades of sequels have expanded and complicated the mythology, the simplicity of that mother-son relationship remains the franchise's most human element. The victims of Crystal Lake number in the hundreds across all films, a body count that dwarfs most other horror franchises. Yet they are rarely mourned within the films themselves, rarely given the weight that their deaths would carry in reality. They exist to fall, to demonstrate Jason's capabilities, to provide the thrills that audiences expect from slasher cinema. This has been criticized as dehumanizing, as reducing characters to mere props for violence, and the criticism has merit. Yet there is something almost mythological in the pattern, the endless procession of young people who venture where they should not go and pay the price that such ventures have always demanded. They are sacrifices to something ancient, something that predates Jason himself, the darkness that has always waited in the woods for those foolish enough to enter. Friday the 13th, as a date, has become inextricably linked with the franchise, despite the original film choosing that title primarily for marketing reasons. The superstition surrounding the date predates the movies by centuries, rooted in religious symbolism and cultural tradition. But for many people alive today, the first association with Friday the 13th is not bad luck in general, but Jason Voorhees specifically. The franchise has claimed the date, transformed it from vague superstition into specific cinematic memory. When Friday the 13th appears on calendars, people think of hockey masks and summer camps and the shores of a lake in New Jersey that exists more vividly in fiction than any real location ever could. The future of Friday the 13th remains uncertain as legal battles continue, and the entertainment landscape shifts toward streaming and shared universes. Horror has experienced a renaissance in recent years, with elevated genre films earning critical acclaim alongside commercial success. There is space for Jason in this new horror landscape, though what form his return might take remains unknown. A streaming series could explore the mythology in greater depth than theatrical films allowed. A new film could either continue the remake's continuity or return to the original timeline. Crossovers with other horror properties remain perpetually discussed, but never quite realized. Whatever comes next, Jason will adapt as he has always adapted, finding new victims in new contexts, his mask appearing wherever darkness gathers. The legacy of Jason Voorhees extends beyond cinema into the broader culture of fear. He represents something primal, the danger that lurks beyond the boundaries of civilization, the price paid for venturing where safety cannot follow. He is the shadow in the woods, the shape glimpsed at the edge of firelight, the reason our ancestors huddled in caves and built walls against the night. That these fears now wear a hockey mask and stalk through summer camps rather than primordial forests changes nothing essential. The fear remains the same, ancient and enduring, finding new forms in each generation while remaining fundamentally unchanged. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can see Crystal Lake in your mind's eye. The water lies still and dark, reflecting stars that have watched over this place for millennia. The forest presses close to the shore, pines and oaks standing silent, witness to everything that has happened here. Somewhere in that darkness, something waits. It has always waited, will always wait, patient as stone and inevitable as the coming of night. The legend of Jason Voorhees is the legend of fear itself, the story we tell ourselves about the darkness we cannot escape. And like all true legends, it will never really end. The cabins stand empty now, their windows dark, their doors hanging open to the night air. No counselors sing songs around campfires. No children splash in the shallow water near the docks. The camp that was Camp Crystal Lake exists only in memory and in film, preserved in the amber of cinema for as long as people continue to watch. And they will continue to watch. They will always continue to watch. Because Jason Voorhees speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the knowledge that we are vulnerable, that safety is an illusion, that the monsters we fear are real in ways that matter more than physical existence. The hockey mask rests somewhere in the depths, perhaps, or hangs on a wall in a collector's home, or waits in a prop warehouse for the call that will bring it back to screens once more. Wherever it is, it carries with it the weight of over 4 decades of horror, the accumulated fear of millions of viewers who watched through splayed fingers as Jason did his work. It is just a mask, a piece of plastic and paint, and yet it is so much more. It is the face of our nightmares, the symbol of everything that frightens us about the dark spaces at the edge of the map. It is Jason Voorhees, and Jason Voorhees is forever. The water of Crystal Lake laps gently against the shore, the same sound it has made for thousands of years, long before any camp was built, long before any tragedy occurred. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small dramas that play out beneath them. Somewhere, an owl calls. Somewhere, a fish breaks the surface of the water. Somewhere, in the deep places where light does not reach, something stirs and settles and waits for whatever comes next. The story of Jason Voorhees is complete for now, told from beginning to end, from a drowning child to an immortal legend. But stories like this never truly end. They only pause, gathering strength for the next telling, the next appearance, the next moment when the hockey mask emerges from darkness and the legend continues. Sleep well. The lake is quiet tonight. And somewhere in the darkness, Jason waits, as he has always waited, as he will always wait, eternal and patient, and never truly gone. This is his story. This is his legacy. This is the history of Jason Voorhees, told in full, from the tragedy that created him to the legend he became. May it drift through your dreams like mist over water, like moonlight through pines, like the memory of something ancient and terrible, and strangely beautiful in its endurance. Good night.